I knew that I wanted to do some sort of filmmaking career. Um, didn't really know what that would look like. I thought I might end up in Hollywood or something like that. But once I started going to school in the UP, the wilderness up there is pretty incredible, and I fell in love with that right away. So just kind of naturally, I combined my two favorite things, which was photography and hiking. Um, and kind of over the years, that evolved into more of a focus on videos. And as I spent more time out in the wilderness, I kind of developed a story that I wanted to tell through my wilderness journeys and filmmaking and all that too. Um, and now it's kind of become my goal over the past 3 or 4 years, I think, to use outdoor filmmaking as a way of communicating this story of mine, which is kind of like self-exploration through exploring the wilderness and using that time out there to kind of explore the deeper questions in life. And I think that's something that I'll probably be exploring for the rest of my career as a filmmaker. So with that, I'll get into the presentation. So this is kind of for general adventure filmmaking. It's not going to be strictly focused on backpacking, although that's mostly what I do. But it can kind of be applied to a whole bunch of different things that way. So I think if you do want to get into outdoor filmmaking, you should kind of define a purpose of what you're trying to do and why you're doing this. And I'm going to break down basically 3 categories, the way that I see it, for reasons why people might want to get into outdoor filmmaking. So the first purpose would be kind of strictly informational. This is going to be your simplest form of video, and it's basically just for documenting the sights and the sounds while you're out there. This will be for the purpose of remembering the experience for yourself and to gather info about the route, maybe share it online to inform others. You could put it up on a blog, but it's going to be a low production value type video that's real quick and easy to make, and it's going to be mostly just for yourself. Best to share with friends and family or sharing to blogs. You could also advertise products this way, and that might be a way to actually make a little bit of money with this kind of filmmaking. The next type would be to capture more of the personal experience. So this would kind of include everything that an informational type video might have, but it's going to also include more personal experiences of yourself. So more commentary, where you're talking about thoughts and feelings that you might have on the hike. And the vlog style is where you're just holding the camera out in front of you while you talk to it. So you're going to be capturing more than just scenery. You're including the human experience and the emotional journey of this adventure too. And that kind of adds an extra layer of depth to the movie. It involves a little bit more planning during the filming and a little bit more editing after you're done filming too, because you're going to have to cut some dialogue together and weave a little bit of a story into the video. So uses for this would be similar to an informational video, but it includes more of a personal touch. And this is a really popular YouTube format. You're going to see a lot of people on YouTube do videos like this, where they document the journey, but they also talk about thoughts and feelings that they're having during the journey too. It kind of humanizes the video, and it makes it easier for other people to relate to it. So so the video works for a wider audience that way. And then the third type of movie is definitely the most in-depth and most work in order to make this type of movie, and that's more of a full-length narrative. It includes elements of the previous types, but it's also going to be it's going to include a very well-organized storyline or theme. It's by far the most intensive filming and editing process, and it can take a lot of time and planning to work out beforehand. This is kind of what I do with most of my movies, where the adventure itself is just more of a backdrop to explore certain ideas or themes. This movie should seek to answer some questions or tell some sort of a story beyond just what's actually happening during the adventure. One thing you can do is interview others about the themes, or you can narrate things about the theme yourself. So you're kind of adding another layer of storytelling by including other people or by adding the narration yourself. The storyline, ideas, and themes should be planned out well in advance. So you should kind of have an idea what the movie's going to look like before you even start filming. And I should say that this type of filmmaking takes some practice too. It's probably not something that you want to just jump into right away. You'll want to be making some simpler edits before you try and do something like this. And some of the uses for this type of film, it's best for feature-length films, so something that's like an hour to 2 hours long. And this is the kind of movie that you'll see in film festivals, and it's going to reach the widest amount of audience because it'll cover topics that are most relatable to a lot of people instead of a real narrow topic of like the specific trail that you're hiking or whatever it might be. You could use it to support a movement even, like environmentalism. I see a lot of movies like this at film festivals. And you can just bring awareness to any sort of topic too. So now that we've defined some different types of movies, I'll get into the camera gear.
Alex, I might jump in real quick here just to remind everybody, if you have a question, just call it out or you can type it on the chat. And Alex, I think you might encourage discussion of some of the topics too. So I just wanted to remind everybody of that.
Yep, definitely feel free to interrupt me. So as we get into camera gear, obviously camera technology is changing and improving so quickly these days. It's kind of hard to recommend a real specific set of gear, but I'll get into basically two kits that I would think about when it comes to outdoor filmmaking. The first kit is going to be your most basic and lightest setup that you can have for outdoor filmmaking. This is ideal for beginners and where production quality is not the most important goal. This is going to prioritize lightweight, simplicity, and low cost. So this is a really good way to get started. It's ideal for informational and personal experience type movies. I wouldn't really recommend this for a full-length narrative, although you could do it. I generally think for a longer movie like that, you'll want a higher production value. So the best camera that you can use for this type of setup is your smartphone, basically, because you're probably already going to have that with you. And the cameras on smartphones nowadays are amazingly good. You can actually get pretty good results out of that once you kind of learn how to manipulate the settings on the camera phone a little bit. And there are special apps you can download too that allow you to get a little bit more custom control over the camera on your phone. And you'll want some sort of tripod too. This thing called a Gorilla Pod is super lightweight, super small, really cheap, and it's got flexible legs, so you can kind of wrap those legs around tree branches and stuff. And it's a really versatile little tripod, so you can set your camera up pretty much anywhere that way. The on-camera mic, definitely the most expensive piece of kit here, other than your phone. And although the cameras on the phones are really good, the microphones on them are still lacking a little bit. So you'll want a decent quality audio for shooting these videos, especially if you're going to be talking to the camera, like shooting those vlog style things. So the example that I have here is the Rode on-camera mic. There's a bunch of different mics you can get that'll plug directly into your phone. That one looks like it's made for an iPhone. But one thing you want to look for here is to get a microphone that has a windscreen, especially if you're shooting outside. If you're shooting in windy conditions, you'll want something to dampen the wind noise, because that can really ruin the audio. And then if you're going to be out for more than a couple days, you're going to want a battery pack to charge your phone off of. I think a lot of people have those already. And if you're going to be out for maybe a week or so, depending on how much storage you have on your phone, you might want to be able to offload all of that footage onto an SD card. Especially if you're shooting a lot of video, that can add up real quick. Just kind of as a rough estimate, I would say if you're on like a 5-day trip, you'll want at least 64 gigs of free space on your phone. And if you don't have that, you'll probably be offloading footage so you can make more room to keep recording video. So you can get something like this card reader that'll plug directly into your phone, and then any old SD card you can plug in there, and then you can offload all your footage onto that, so then you can keep filming. So moving on to a more advanced camera setup, while still being kind of weight conscious, because obviously you still have to carry all this gear, so you can't have the highest quality camera gear. This is basically what I used to film the Hayduke Trail movie, Figure It Out. This is definitely ideal for high quality productions, full-length narrative films, something where high production value is a priority. And you've got to be kind of dedicated to first carrying the gear, but also taking the time to get the shots when you're going to carry all this stuff too. It's definitely way more complicated. It's a lot more weight, more expensive, but you get what you pay for, so you're going to get much more professional results this way. That's a list of all the camera gear. In the next slide, I'll have pictures of everything with prices and weight and stuff. So what I used on the Hayduke Trail was a Sony mirrorless camera. I had the A6500. Since then, they've come out with a new version, the A6400. It's a little bit better in smaller ways, but it's basically the same camera. I think that's probably the best combination of small and lightweight camera that you can get right now for the quality, because the image quality that comes out of that camera is really impressive. It'll shoot in 4K, really high resolution still images too. You can get good slow motion out of it, and the whole camera body weighs less than a pound. So the lens actually is going to weigh more than the camera body, at least the one that I'm recommending here. You can definitely get cheaper, lighter lenses, but for my through hikes, I like to have a all-in-one lens, something that has a really good zoom range. So I'm recommending that 18 to 200 millimeter lens. At 18 millimeters, that's a really good wide angle, so you can get your landscape shots and stuff like that. And then if you see wildlife or something far away that you want to zoom in on, you don't have to change lenses. It's all in the same package right there.
Alex, what's the specialty stuff that you use for your great night sky photography?
It's that setup, that camera and that lens. I can talk a little bit about the settings for that and time lapses and stuff. That's a little bit of a separate topic, but I'll try and briefly go over that. So for the night sky time lapses, you'll need a tripod. So you set the camera up on the tripod and you're doing long exposure pictures. So I'm usually doing about 15 to 20 second exposures. If you go much longer with this lens, the stars will start to trail. So if you do like a 30-second exposure, the stars won't look like pinpoints of light. They'll kind of look like trailing lines. So I like to avoid that. So that's why I keep it around 15 to 20 seconds. And you want to have your aperture as wide open as possible. I think on that lens, it's f3.5 is the biggest opening. The lens that I have up here isn't ideal for star pictures. You kind of need a dedicated, fast, big aperture lens for getting really good star pictures, but this setup works out pretty well. So once I dial in the settings, there's also a program on the camera that's made for time lapses. So I can just tell it to take a picture every minute or whatever I set it to. So every minute it'll take a 15-second exposure, and then I'll go to bed and just let the camera run until the battery dies. And so then in the morning I'll have roughly 300 pictures. And then when I get back home, I can turn all those pictures into a video where each picture turns into one frame in the time lapse. So if you're talking about video, it's usually 24 frames per second. So 24 pictures from that time lapse equals 1 second of time lapse video, if that makes sense. It can get kind of technical. But usually 300 picture time lapse is, I think, like 6 seconds, something like that. Yeah, so that's how I do those night sky time lapses. And then moving on to the video mic, that's basically the same microphone that I recommended for the iPhone mic, but this one just plugs into the camera. It's a really simple, small microphone. All auto settings. You don't have to like manually adjust anything. All you do is plug it in and it's good to go. And I've gotten really good results with that, even in high wind. One thing I didn't carry on the Hayduke was this wired lavalier mic, and that's kind of used exclusively for shooting interviews. That's something that I realized that I should have had, because a couple of my interviews from the Hayduke movie didn't turn out so well. There's a lot of background noise in the audio, and having a lavalier mic kind of fixes that. Then another essential is to have a tripod. And if you're going to be shooting a lot of video, you'll want a pretty sturdy tripod. You don't want to have some flimsy thing that's going to shake in the wind and stuff like that. So the tripod's probably going to be your heaviest item, maybe other than the drone, but the drone's kind of optional. So you'll want to pick your tripod carefully and pick something that's a good combination of lightweight but also sturdy. So the carbon fiber tripods make a good combination for that.
Alex, Ross has a question. How often do you get the tripod out for clips while moving?
That's a good question, because a lot of the time I try to avoid that. It's kind of a lot of extra work and a few extra steps to set the tripod up and then put the camera on it and everything. But basically there's only 2 instances where I use the tripod, and it's to get walk-by shots, which I'll explain a little bit later. But those are basically what they sound like. You put the camera on a tripod and then you walk by the camera. So then you get a good view of the landscape and the person walking through it. And pretty much the only other time I use the tripod is for time lapses. Sometimes if I want to get a nice close-up of some thing in nature or something like that, I'll put the camera on the tripod too. But I actually try not to use it too much. And that's actually changed over the years as camera technology gets better. Because my first movie, A Sense of Direction on the PNT, I was using a DSLR camera that didn't have any image stabilization. So my handheld shots were really shaky. But now with these new cameras, the Sony mirrorless camera has in-body image stabilization. So that means that the sensor is actually gyroscopically stabilized, and there's a stabilizer inside the lens. So you can actually get pretty good stable handheld shots. So that's why I don't need to use the tripod as much. And then to use, or to have the camera accessible all the time, I use this camera clip by a company called Peak Design. I don't think there's any other companies that make anything like that. I've seen a few things that are similar, but they don't really work the same way. And this camera clip has made the biggest difference for what I do, especially because I don't want to have to take my backpack off every time I get the camera out, and I want my camera to be very accessible at all times, especially if you see wildlife or something like that. You might only have like 3 seconds to get a shot off. So you want to have the camera right there and ready to go. And that clip just clips onto your backpack strap, and then the tripod block screws into the camera. And um, you want to, when you do get that, you'll want to make sure that the tripod block also fits the mount on your tripod. So that way you can take your camera from the clip on your backpack and put it right onto your tripod. It's kind of a universal mount, so a lot of tripods do fit that, but that was something that I had to modify when I was getting that clip to make sure the camera would fit on both the clip and the tripod. Then same thing as the simpler camera kit, you'll want a battery pack to charge off of. And this is another thing that's changed as camera technology has changed. When I was using the DSLR, I don't think there was any USB charging options for that. The only way you could charge those batteries was by plugging it into the wall. And now the mirrorless cameras, you can just plug a USB cord into that and you can charge the battery right in the camera, or you can get a separate battery charger that also charges via USB. So that makes a big difference too for when you're out there for long periods of time and you have to charge batteries. And then depending on how long you're going to stay out, you'll definitely want a bunch of batteries and a bunch of SD cards. I think for the Hey Duke, I carried 7 batteries and something like 400 or 500 gigabytes worth of SD card storage. And on those longer sections, when I was out for 7 or 8 days, I think I ended up charging all those batteries at least once, maybe twice. So I was ending up using somewhere between like 14 and 21 batteries. That is the one downside about this camera that I have recommended here. Because it is so tiny, the batteries are pretty small and they don't last very long. So you'll be recharging stuff a bunch. And then we can move on to the drone. This is kind of an optional thing, but if you're willing to carry the weight, the quality of video that you can get by using one of these drones is just unbelievable. I've been just blown away by how good the drone technology is getting. I think I got my first drone in 2016, and I've been flying them a lot since then. On the Hey Duke, I tried to bring my DJI Mavic Pro, which is a different drone than I have shown here. It's a little bit bigger, and that was kind of their first foldable drone that was on the market. And it was, for what it was at the time, it was unbelievable because it was so small. The drone was only like the size of a football, and it was super portable. But for long distance backpacking, it was still a little bit too big. So that was when I got to a point, I think I was like 70 miles into the Hey Duke, and I was about to start a 100-mile section. So I had to put about 7 days worth of food in my backpack. And once I had that food in there, there was no room for the drone. So I kind of had to make a choice between drone or food. So that was the point where I sent the drone home. But since the Hey Duke, I've gotten a new drone. This is a DJI Mavic Air. It's much smaller, much lighter, and really you don't sacrifice any image quality or flight quality or anything like that. The signal connection between the remote controller and the drone is not quite as good, but that's basically the only difference. That Mavic Air is still really high quality. And there's a few other cheaper options on the market too. I think there's a DJI Spark. I want to say that's only like $400 or $500, but then you're definitely taking a hit in video quality for that one. But this Mavic Air, I have done some longer backpacking trips with it, and it is small enough and light enough that I'm able to carry that and still carry like 7 days worth of food. The GoPro is another thing that's, I would say, is optional, but it has its uses. Lately, I've been using the GoPro a lot for kind of action shots, or the types of shots that would be really hard to film on my own with my main camera. If I'm climbing up and down a cliff or something like that, or doing something that's kind of dangerous, something that I don't want to do more than once, the GoPro is a nice way to film that, because then I can just put that on the head strap and wear that on my head. And then you get a different point of view. Adds a little bit more action and motion to the shots too. And obviously the GoPros are waterproof and shockproof, and you don't really have to take care of them at all. So you can use that to film when weather conditions are terrible or something like that. And then if you're doing a through hike, this is kind of only necessary if you're doing a really long distance hike. If you're only out for a week, you don't really need this NAR box to back up your footage. But if you are out for a really long trip and you're not going to be able to offload footage in any way, the NAR box is, I think, again, it's one of those products where I think there's only one company that's making something like this. And it's basically like having a laptop without the screen, and your phone becomes the screen. So your phone can connect to the NAR box via Wi-Fi signal, and then you can plug in your SD cards into the NAR box, and you can offload all your footage onto it. And you can even edit your videos and edit your pictures and all kinds of stuff with the app on your phone. You can also plug in external hard drives into the NAR box, so you can offload footage that way. That's what I was doing for the Hey Duke. So every time I got into town, I would offload that section's worth of footage onto an external hard drive, and then I would do it all again onto another external hard drive, so that way I had everything backed up redundantly. I was using version 1 of the NAR box at that time, and I think they still had a lot of bugs to figure out, because I had a lot of problems with it. It was pretty glitchy, and it was kind of frustrating to use. Actually, one of my hard drives erased itself one time, so that was pretty terrifying. Luckily, I still had all the footage on the SD cards, so I was able to re-import everything. But the one that I have pictured here is version 2, and I'm pretty sure that they worked out a lot of those kinks, so it's probably, I would assume it's pretty good to go by now.
So we've had a couple people join us since the last time we put out some instructions. We are going to be sharing this PowerPoint and the video, so you don't have to worry about madly scribbling everything down. Also, if you have a question, just go ahead and call it out, or you can use the chat function and type your question on the chat.
All right, so now we're getting into shooting techniques. Obviously, the goal is to capture your adventure. I'll talk about a few real basic types of shots to get and ways to film. If you know anything about movie making, this will probably be pretty obvious to you, but I'll just kind of go over the basics here. Adventure films rely heavily on B-roll because obviously they take place in very scenic areas, so you want to use your B-roll to show the audience how pretty these places are. And your B-roll is basically your filler shots. It's scenery or anything that establishes the place that you're in. Your A-roll is basically what drives the story. So these are going to be your interviews, anytime you're talking to the camera, or anytime you're like showing an event that's happening. And then another thing you can use is a montage. This is where you compress a lot of information or shots into kind of a small space. You'll show a lot of scenery or a lot of action shots. It's usually set to music. And it's kind of a good way to transition from one thing to another. So it's a good place for a lot of those shots that don't really have a place in the story either. So if you just have a whole bunch of nice scenery shots, you can just throw those together and do a montage.
Alex, will you talk at some point about when you use kind of the fast motion and where that's a useful tool?
Is that the time lapses?
No, the where you kind of speed up the film.
Oh, in a montage? Or I'm not sure what you mean.
Yeah. When do you like to use
okay.
Yeah.
I think the best place to use montages is as a transition. So if you have two topics that are kind of unrelated and maybe you don't know how to connect them, you can place a montage in between those two topics, and that's a good way to transition from one thing to another. And I think I'll talk a little bit more about that later on too when I get into editing. I see a question on the chat about drones too. Yeah, so Ron asked about using drones in national parks or wilderness areas, and if I've run into any issues with that, or have I upset any people. um, that was actually another part of the reason why I sent the drone home on the Hayduke Trail, because I think like 60 or 70% of the Hayduke Trail is either in wilderness area or national park. So I wouldn't have been able to use the drone for a good portion of the trail, and I would just be carrying dead weight through those portions. So that wasn't very appealing to me. um, so that's kind of a bummer, but I totally understand. I wouldn't want 1,000 drones flying around national parks and stuff like that. Um, as far as if I've had any issues with it, I don't think so. Um, I can only think of one incident basically where actually I was allowing my friend to fly my drone, and we were flying at this national forest area. It was kind of popular, so there were some other people around, and he was just playing with it, just hovering kind of above the shoreline by Lake Superior. And there was a family on the shoreline, and they got kind of pissed off that the drone was hovering above them. They thought that we were like watching them or something. But it was just my friend who didn't really know what he was doing. So for the most part, I've actually found that it's actually kind of interesting. When I first got the drone in 2016, people thought it was the coolest thing ever when they saw me flying it. And like, it didn't even take a year and everybody got used to them, and everybody basically ignored me when they saw me flying the drone after that. So I think people don't really care anymore. They know what it is now, and it's kind of just like you're out there taking pictures. All right, so using or talking about B-roll examples, the walk by, which I talked about earlier, that's kind of my bread and butter shot for hiking movies. It's a good way to establish the place that you're in and to kind of show people what the area is like, what you're walking through. And just kind of a general rule of filmmaking is that it's good to include people in your shots, just because people are watching your videos, and they're going to, when they see people in the videos, they can kind of put themselves in their shoes easier. It's more easier to relate when people are in the video. And from an editing perspective, you can use the walk by to cover up jump cuts in your narration or your interviews. I'll talk a little bit more about jump cuts later, but basically that's when you cut a section out from an interview. So if somebody stumbles over their words, or they have to repeat something, or you just want to cut a section out, there's going to be a cut in that video where the person's going to kind of jump because you cut out 5 seconds from that timeline or whatever. And usually it's kind of unprofessional to show those jump cuts. So you want to cover that up with B-roll. Lifestyle shots, another example of B-roll. And it's basically what it sounds like, just capturing what it's like to live on the trail. Cooking, resting, walking, setting up camp, crossing rivers, dirty clothes, laughing with friends, whatever kind of captures the moment or what it's like to be out there. And your scenery. Obviously, you're going to be shooting a lot of scenery shots on any sort of adventure film. Some examples are a slow, wide-angle pan across a scenic landscape. And ideally, you would want a certain type of tripod for this, which is called a fluid head tripod. But those are kind of expensive, and they're usually really big and bulky. I don't carry a fluid head tripod when I'm hiking. I haven't found one that's light and small enough yet to make it worth it. But basically, there's some fluid inside the head, and it dampens your shaky hand, because almost nobody can pan perfectly smoothly. So with this technology that's in the tripod head, it basically smooths out your pan, so you get a smooth looking pan across the landscape. But if you don't have one of those tripods, you can just do a handheld pan. It won't look quite as good, but with the stabilization inside the camera, it's still pretty good. Still close-ups of natural features. This might be like shooting wildflowers or bugs or some sort of detail on the rock or something like that. And time lapses, those are kind of my signature thing, I guess. That's my favorite type of thing to shoot out in the wilderness is time lapses. A lot of people don't do them because they're a lot of work and they take up a lot of space on your SD cards, and they kill batteries really fast. They're basically a very expensive thing to shoot when you have very limited resources out there. So I carry a lot of extra batteries and SD card space, so I can shoot a lot of time lapses just because I really like how they look. And it's kind of a way for me to let the camera work while I take a break and eat a snack or something. And really heightens the production value of the movie too, because the time lapses look really cool. And wildlife, obviously. And I found, unless you're actually going out specifically to shoot wildlife, it's actually pretty hard to find a lot of wildlife while you're hiking. People always ask me how many animals and stuff I've seen on my through hikes, and I actually don't see that many animals on my through hikes because I'm moving pretty fast. I'm making kind of a lot of noise while I move, and I'm sure the animals hear or smell me long before I see them, and they probably get out of there. So if you do see wildlife out there, it's kind of a rare opportunity, and you're probably only going to have a few seconds to get a shot before they run away. At least that's the idea. Hopefully you're not running into any bears that want to cause havoc. So some examples of A-roll. This is a vlog style. This is a super common thing that you see on YouTube, which is you're basically just holding the camera out in front of you and talking to it. It's the easiest and simplest way to record your thoughts. Other things you can do is talk about your plans or maybe recap an experience you just had. And you'll usually talk for a while, and then when you get to editing, you'll cut out bits and pieces from this dialogue, and then you'll use the B-roll to cover up the jump cuts. So when you're shooting these vlogs, don't feel like you have to say everything perfectly within one take. It's perfectly okay if you only get a sentence or two out, and then you have to think for a minute, or you have to ramble on a little bit to get your point out. You should see some of my vlogs from the Hey Duke movie. Some of the more complicated ideas that I was trying to talk about. I might have talked for 15 minutes and only used like 45 seconds from that whole rambling on. So it's perfectly okay to just cut out the good parts from your dialogue there. And then interviews it's kind of a step up. It's a big commitment to shoot interviews. It's a lot more work to shoot them while you're out there, and it's a lot more work to edit them once you're home. But it does add a level of production value to your movie that makes it seem a little bit more professional. You get a whole bunch of different other points of view that way too. So it kind of makes your movies more relatable because you have different types of people talking about stuff. Usually you'll want to find some sort of a scenic place to sit people down and ask some questions related to your theme. You'll want to find something with a background that's not too distracting, so something with not a ton of detail in it. And the most important thing is to find a place with very little background noise and basically no wind. It's very important to get good quality audio when you're shooting interviews. And like I said, on the Hey Duke movie, there were a couple interviews there that I didn't get the best quality audio. And that's when I could have been using a lavalier mic. If you haven't seen those, or if you don't know what those are, they're just a tiny little microphone that clips onto the person's shirt right below their chin. And then the wire usually goes down their shirt, so it's kind of concealed. They make wireless ones, but obviously if you're out there on an adventure, it's simpler to have a wired mic, and then that'll just plug directly into your camera. I should also mention too, when you're shooting interviews, it helps to have some headphones with you, and it helps to have a camera that has a headphone jack, because a lot of them don't. That's kind of a higher price point. So that way you can monitor the audio and you can hear if something is going wrong. A lot of times you won't be able to pick it up with your ears if there's like wind in the microphone or some distracting background noise or something like that. But if you're listening to the interview while you're giving it, sometimes you can pick up those distractions too. And as far as interview style, it's good to ask open-ended questions so that you don't get yes or no answers, and allow people to ramble. It's okay if they don't really know what they're talking about or if they're kind of searching for words. I've found it's best to not cut people off while they're talking, because usually they know what they want to say, they just don't know how to say it. And maybe it takes them a few attempts to kind of get the words out correctly. And if you cut somebody off, you might not get that idea on film. You're going to be cutting probably 80 to 90% of the interview anyway. Remember that your voice will be cut from the interview. So get people to answer questions in a way that doesn't require hearing the question to understand. It's kind of hard to comprehend that until you've done it a few times. But like an example of a bad question would be, do you like hiking? And the answer is yes. People are only going to hear yes, so that's not going to make sense. So a good example would be like, what do you enjoy about hiking? And then somebody could say, my favorite thing about hiking is getting away from the constant noise of the city. So that second answer doesn't need any context. You can just hear the answer and understand exactly what the person's talking about. And this is something that takes practice. I've been an apprentice under a documentary filmmaker for the past like 4 or 5 years. And this guy's been making movies or documentaries since like the 1970s, and he's really good at giving interviews. So I was just a camera guy, so I got to sit there and listen to him give interviews, and that's been a good learning experience. Because there's kind of a certain way to lead people into this certain questions and answers that you want to get from them. And that's not to say that you're telling them what to say, but it's helping them answer the questions in a way that makes sense for editing later on. All right, so story structure. Now we're going to get into editing a little bit. This is kind of a mantra that I always have to tell myself, is beginning, middle, and end. This is something that you should be thinking about during all phases of the movie making process. Whether you're shooting a simple informational video or a full-length narrative, you should always be thinking about that. Obviously, the movie as a whole needs to have an intro that'll kind of establish what it's going to be about. It'll prepare the audience for what they're about to watch. The main content of the movie, which is the middle, is going to be about 80% of it. That's obviously most of the movie. And then towards the end, you want to have some sort of conclusion that starts to wrap everything up. And you'll want to let the viewers know that the movie is coming to an end a little bit before it actually happens, so they can kind of prepare for that, and it's not just an abrupt ending. And then within that main structure is a whole number of smaller stories. This could get about as complicated as you want it to. And these are all smaller stories or scenes that are kind of nested in there, and they each have their own beginning, middle, and end. Basically, every major event in the movie should have shots or dialogue or something that establishes the beginning and middle and end of that event. Editing the story structure. This could be a seminar of its own. There's so much that has to do with editing. It's kind of its own separate topic. But here I'll just kind of talk about the basics of it. One thing that I found to be super valuable before editing a movie is to write down the questions that you are trying to answer or the story that you're trying to tell, and refer to this note every time you question whether something should be included or not, because it's very easy to get off course otherwise. We all have shots that we really like, but they don't really fit into the story in any way. And by including them in the movie, they actually make the movie worse, even though it's a cool shot, because it just doesn't really make sense to put them there. So actually the guy that I've been apprenticing under told me a funny phrase about that when it comes to editing, is that editors have to kill their babies, because we all have really nice shots that we really like and they become our babies, but if they don't fit, they don't fit, so we have to kill them. If there are vlogs or interviews or dialogue and stuff like that, you should edit that first. That's your A roll, and that's what drives the story. Don't worry about making it look good. It's gonna have a ton of jump cuts, and it's gonna not make a whole lot of sense visually. But all you're worried about here is the dialogue and making sure that you have a good cohesive story, because that's the driver of your movie. That's what your movie is made up of. So you want to kind of make that foundation first, and then you can throw a whole bunch of pretty B-roll on top of it to cover up the jump cuts and kind of make everything look nice. And just like filming, editing should always be done according to beginning, middle, and end. I kind of look at, when I look at a movie on the timeline, I'm kind of seeing a whole bunch of series of intertwined stories, and each one has its own beginning and middle and end. And when you're choosing clips or video to put into the timeline, you're kind of piecing a puzzle together. So you have your main story, which is the whole overarching beginning, middle, and end, and then you have your maybe hundreds of little stories intertwined in there. So when you're choosing clips based on how do they fit into those intertwined stories, and how do they improve that story and tell it in a more concise way. Another thing to pay attention to is pacing. And an engaging movie is always moving between fast and slow pacing. So for example, action-packed clips should have a lot of fast cuts, and there should be a lot of different clips in there. And that'll create more of a intense feel to the movie. And then maybe scenery or contemplative dialogue should have longer clips and fewer cuts. And you're always kind of transitioning between fast and slow that way. And then this is another chance to work in a montage. This could be a place where you can work in those babies of clips that you really like but maybe don't have a place for. You could just throw it in a montage. And it's a technique of condensing clips, scenes, or events and information into a short scene. So it's usually set to music, and they make good transitions from one topic to another. So I've also found that a good place to use a montage is maybe after you've had like a real heavy session of dialogue. So maybe you've shot a few interviews and you have people talking about some sort of complicated idea for 5 minutes, and it's kind of requires the audience to pay very close attention to the dialogue and what people are talking about. And after that, it's good to kind of build in a break. So a montage doesn't require as much close attention for people to understand what's going on. And then after the montage, you can go into something more complicated again. So I've been kind of talking about story a lot, and now we can talk a little bit about how you might find your story. Obviously, I think story is everything, and this is something that they really harped on when I was in school for this, because I went to school for digital cinema. Obviously, it's good to have nice camera gear and to get really pretty shots and everything, but none of that really means anything if you don't have an engaging story. Your story personalizes your movie, and it separates your movie from others in the same genre. And I think finding your story starts with a set of questions you want to answer, and even informational videos try to answer questions. So if you're going to be making a movie, you should kind of have a set of questions that you're trying to answer. For the informational type videos, some examples might be, what is your adventure, where does it go, and what does it look like, and what is it like to hike it. Those are all pretty obvious things. You don't really have to do any planning. All you have to do is go out there and capture what you see and do. And then moving up, talking about more personal experience videos, it's kind of all the similar questions as the informational video, plus some more. So you'll be asking, what am I feeling during this adventure? What am I thinking about? And why am I out here doing this adventure? So these questions are kind of more centered on you and what's going on personally in your mind. And you can see as we move up the types of videos that we're adding complexity to, and much more engaging story, I think, as we move into the narrative type video. So all the same questions as the previous ones, plus a lot more. These questions go beyond you, and I think they should be relatable to a larger audience. Getting into this style of movie, these questions could be about just about anything. It could be completely unrelated to the adventure or the wilderness that you're in. But I think the important thing is that the topic should be important to you, and something that you want to explore in a deep and honest way. And that's because movie making in general is a lot of work, but this type of movie is a ton of work. And if you're not pretty deeply emotionally invested in it, it's hard to do the amount of work that it takes to actually complete a full-length narrative like this. To find the topic that's important to you, I'm just speaking from my own personal experience now. This is just kind of what I've done, but I think it could work for other people too, is to pay attention to what you think about while you're on your adventures, and especially when you're by yourself. And to look at these thoughts and try to extract topics or themes that everybody can relate to. So an example might be when you're alone on the trail, you think about your significant other or your dog or something, and you shouldn't make a movie about your dog. You should make it about companionship, because nobody else really cares about your dog, but everybody can relate to companionship. So by generalizing that, it makes it more relatable to a wider audience. And this is another thing that's kind of personal to me. It's worked out really well for me, but there's probably many other ways to find your story. But as far as what I've done is to be willing to look at the uncomfortable feelings or thoughts that you have while you're out there. The things that you would rather avoid often make for really engaging content. And chances are that a lot of other people are avoiding those same kinds of thoughts. So if you're brave enough to kind of explore those things and talk about them openly, a lot of people are going to relate.
Alex, would you be willing to share an example or two of that?
Of some of the uncomfortable things?
Yeah, just what an uncomfortable story looks like and how you build it into a film.
Yeah. So something I talked about on the Hey Duke. Trying to think of a good example. I think to maybe not take yourself so seriously. Like hiking the Hey Duke Trail was a very humbling experience. I might have come into that trail with a little bit of an ego and kind of feeling like I've done some long distance hikes before and this trail will be no problem. But obviously I had to kind of confront that while I was out there. And the Hey Duke and just the wilderness in general kind of proved to me that I should never take myself too seriously, and I'm not sure what else.
Yeah, that's something everybody can relate to.
Yeah.
Got you to the figure it out on the hey.
Yep, exactly. um, I might think of some better examples later on, but I'll keep going. um, so your story will evolve over time, and it's not something that you should expect to be fully developed right away. It takes a lot of time and energy to develop a story into a comprehensive theme. To use myself as an example again, I sort of discovered my story on the PNT. Um, I refined it on my next trip, which was on the North Country Trail, and it wasn't really fully formed until the Hayduke. So I think maybe another good example of some uncomfortable thought that I kind of had to deal with might be the reason that I did the PNT in the first place, because I had just graduated college, had a degree in digital cinema, but had no job prospects and had no idea how to actually turn that into a career. And I was really afraid that I was going to end up working some like 9 to 5 office job where I wasn't going to have much freedom and wasn't going to be doing much personal growth or anything like that. So I didn't really know what to do, but I knew that I didn't want to do that. And that's when I decided to do the PNT. And when I first made that choice, it was because I was kind of running away from my future. I didn't really know what the future looked like. All I knew is that I didn't really want to deal with it yet. So I kind of went on the trail and kind of escaped regular life or normal reality for a little bit. And while I was out there on the trail, I kind of had to deal with that and figure out what my future might look like, or like, what do I really want out of life? I kind of had to ask myself a lot of big questions, and having all that alone time on the trail and the lack of distractions and all that kind of stuff, it helped me come to a lot of good conclusions about who I was and what I wanted to do with my life. And I tried to work those ideas into the PNT movie, but I didn't do it very well, I don't think. Because when I started the PNT movie, I didn't have any plan. I wanted to make this narrative type movie, but I didn't plan anything out beforehand, which I definitely should have. I just didn't know what the plan would be. So I actually basically made up the entire story of the PNT movie after I got home, and I made it all up in the editing room. I interviewed a lot of people on the trail, and I kind of took themes and ideas that they talked about, and I mixed those with my ideas, and that's kind of where the story came from for the PNT movie. I wouldn't recommend doing it that way though, because that was a lot more work, and there's a lot of wasted time trying to figure out what the story should be after I had filmed everything. And then for my next project on the North Country Trail, I sort of had those ideas in my head, but I didn't really know how to tell that story yet. So the North Country Trail, I kind of look at that as like a transition project between the PNT and the Hayduke project. I was basically just trying to figure things out when I was filming the North Country Trail movie. That one's called Uper Tours. I was trying to figure out how to tell that story and how to film it. So I was doing a lot of experimenting with that project. And then by the time I got to the Hayduke, which was 3 years after the PNT, by then I had thought about my story long enough and experimented with it in a bunch of different ways so that I was able to make a plan for the Hayduke movie, and I kind of had a vision for what that would look like before I actually started filming. So it took me about 2,000 miles and 3 years to get there, to actually kind of figure out what my story was and figure out how to talk about it. And I still don't think I fully have it figured out. I think that's something that I'm going to be exploring for the rest of my career probably. And that's where we get to this. I think exploring is basically your most valuable tool if your goal is to make unique movies that explore ideas that are kind of new to people. I think above all else, finding your story requires exploration, and not just exploration of the outer world, but also of your inner world, and finding out what scares you, what excites you, what bothers you, what motivates you. By doing this exploration, I think a story will emerge out of this. And if you're honest about this stuff, people will relate. And the best way that I've found to explore my inner world is to explore the outer world. I think they kind of go hand in hand. When you enter the wilderness or go into some sort of adventure with the goal of exploration rather than completion or conquering it, I think those are very different goals. I see a lot of people these days, like they want to go out into the mountains so they can climb the highest peaks, and so they can like bag the peaks and get the fastest known times on the trails and stuff like that. And that stuff's all great. It's all very impressive athletic feats for sure. But I've always kind of had a different goal in mind, and that's been more for the exploration, both to explore the wilderness and to kind of explore my inner world. So the only advice that I can give is to go on lots of adventures and to always be seeking out new experiences. And that's pretty much it for what I've got about making movies. I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about what you guys want to make movies about, or any questions that you might have.